while you guys are eating. Just want to welcome you all. Thanks for joining us this evening. I know since daylight savings hits, it kind of kills any sort of motivation you have to do things outside of work once that 5 o'clock rolls around. At least it does for me. I can't speak for you all, but thank you for being here. I appreciate you spending some time with us, and yeah, let's kind of get things going here. So I do have a couple items that I want to address, just housekeeping real quick. If you haven't gotten food already, please do help yourself. Tons of pizza here. I think we're going to have plenty extra, and you'll get a chance. We'll take a break after the first talk, so if you want more later, there will be an opportunity. But food and drink, obviously right here, and then there are restrooms just directly across the hall, some gender-neutral restrooms, and then there's some gender-specific restrooms like around the elevators, closer to the touring entrance. So take your pick there. But yeah, real quick, want to thank our sponsors for tonight. First and foremost being Gusto. They have been an incredible sponsor for us in the last few months and are going to continue to be. So we really appreciate their support, and we couldn't do this without our sponsor help. So also to Turing and Salt, both of those companies enabled us to do this here and host that all on meetup.com. So we really appreciate their support. And if sponsoring is something you're interested in doing, if your company wants to do that, feel free to talk to any of us here in the React Denver shirts, and we'd be happy to help you out. In addition to these sponsors, we also have supporters on our Open Collective page, which is where we take donations and also where we basically handle all of our expenses and reimbursements for the meetup costs. So that's all online on Open Collective and transparent there. It's just opencollective.com/ReactDenver, I believe is the URL for that. But it's a really great way for us to get support from the community and also be transparent about what our money's being spent on. So we've got a couple backers on there. Raheem, where's Raheem at? #1 backer right here in the front row. We appreciate your support. And for the rest of you as well. Jeff too, yeah, shout out. So, but yeah, check that out if you're interested in seeing what we spend our money on. Real quick, I see we have a couple job postings on the whiteboard here, but want to give an opportunity to anybody who's hiring to talk about their openings right now. Anybody? Do you want the mic?
I can just talk really loud.
Sure.
So this is mainly on React, and we're hoping to find somebody that has experience working with a product team and working with UX. So we're kind of looking for a hybrid position.
Okay, so Shapeshift. And just the careers page here works great?
We're hiring for a couple other engineering roles as well. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Shapeshift, we're a crypto exchange, non-custodial crypto exchange.
Cool. Thank you.
I'm David. I work for Gusto. We are hiring across a couple different teams right now. Our stack is pretty much just Ruby Rails with React. So if that interests you, let me know. We are a people platform for small business, which means we do payroll, HR, benefits, finance, and getting into a couple other pretty interesting things, just trying to do anything we can to help small businesses. So if you want, you can talk to me after. Thanks.
Anyone else hiring? Nope. I guess it's that time of year. I feel like last month we had like 8 different job openings, but holidays it gets a little slower. Okay, cool. Well, moving on from that, are there any announcements? I know last month we had some hackathons and things. I'm not sure. Clayton's not here today, so don't know who won that, but any community announcements anyone wants to shout out? Nope. Alrighty. Well, moving on. I am very pleased to have one of our co-organizers giving a talk tonight. So I just want to welcome up Kevin McKernan. He is giving a talk on Redux. So please give him a round of applause.
Thanks, Sam. Let me get set up here real quick. Close everything from earlier. This usually seems, I guess that's not that bad. I don't know. Usually sounds really, really loud when I talk through the mics, so. All right, cool. Yeah, so like Sam was saying, my name is Kevin McKernan, senior front end engineer at AirDNA. My talk tonight is about Redux. There's lots of, we've had a couple talks here. There's lots of stuff online and whatnot of like, oh, well, with all this cool new stuff in React, like Redux is dead, right? And it's not, but I won't spoil the rest of my talk. So quick show of hands, who's worked with Redux? Okay, that was kind of expected. Raise your hand if you haven't enjoyed working with Redux. About half the people. Okay, yeah, seems about right. So most everybody's familiar with it, but just quick overview. So Redux is a state management library. It's not actually unique to React. It's typically used alongside React, but Redux and React Redux are two separate packages. So you can use Redux with Angular. You can use Redux with, any kind of different JavaScript front-end library. You can use it with Vue. All of the things I'm going to be talking about is from the perspective of React because 1, React Meetup, 2, React Developer. So there we go. So kind of the core things in Redux are this global state that is available anywhere in your application that you can grab things out of. The 2 main ways you're interacting with that are actions, which are a description of what you want to do, so an action, and then reducers, which handle those actions and based on what that action is, compute things within your state, return new state based on the action. So, that could be actions in your UI, that could be interactions with an API. So that's what it is at a high level. So we've heard this a lot. So why is Redux dead? So Redux is not dead, but it's not as much of a staple in the React kind of dev stack as it used to be. To React that have come out in the last couple of years. Pretty much if you go back like 2 years ago, you were really, it was, oh, you're building a React app and you're using Redux. And that was just that was how it was. But yeah, so there's a lot more simple options available now, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So people think it's dead because they might not need it anymore. And it's not quite true. It used to be, if you're getting to the point where you feel like you're passing things down, 10 levels deep in an app, I need to move this into Redux. So yeah, so there's a lot of different ways to do that now. That doesn't necessarily make Redux dead. All right, so let's talk about some alternatives for state management. And some of these are kind of direct replace things that Redux does. Some things are, kind of complementary. So the first one is the new context API that came out in React 16 point something about a year and a half ago. So context is a really nice way to store data centrally without having to pass it down through every component. You can set a provider up at the top level of your app, and then further down you can use a consumer to pull that out. This is made even nicer with the hooks API, which is my next point. Being able to just use context to interact with the context is really nice. Hooks also help with state management. Now that there's the use state hook, you used to have to make the decision of, do I want to write a class to have state? Do I want to write just a function component? And now with hooks, that line doesn't really matter anymore. There are some different things with classes, but from the point of view of state management, they're now kind of equal class citizens. Another popular thing is Apollo Client. If you've worked with GraphQL, you've probably worked with Apollo Client. It does pretty much everything between your actual React components that's spitting things out, all the way to interacting with your GraphQL server. So caching data on the front end, you can even store local data in a similar way using Apollo link state. Yeah. Just like one of the oh, why don't you use X when we're talking about Redux is usually mobx. Never looked at it, never touched it, don't know, might be great, haven't used it, not going to talk about it. Okay, so quick example of what context can do that, you know, and I'll be pretty quick through these because just kind of glossing over a couple things. And I actually have, well, I'll just kind of talk about it, and if people have more questions, we can circle back later. But yeah, so with context, you know, you used to, you know, oh, I have something here, and I want to move it down like 3 or 4 levels of components. I have to pass it as a prop all the way down the tree. That gets old, that gets brittle. So the context API for simple things like here, and this is straight out of the React docs. This example is like a theme of like light versus dark mode in an app. And instead of having to pass that around all over the place, it just lives in a context, and then you can pull it out of the context whenever you need it. Hooks, again, example of a state hook in a functional component. And then this is an example of what everything for Apollo Client looks like, which is actually pretty simple, including a GraphQL query in here. And this is using hooks as well. So there's a use query. We've got our GraphQL query here. Loading, handle that, error, handle that, and then here's your data. So all that being said, of all these alternatives, what are the advantages of Redux? And I will definitely throw the caveat in here of when done well. We'll talk about bad things in Redux in a few. And we've probably all fought with them. All right, so first up of good things from Redux, one's data consistency. You know, if you have a endpoint that you're using in multiple places in your app, you don't want to have to do things like, you know, worry about calling that, worry about calling it properly every time. So it's nice to be able to centralize that. It's also, if you have an API response that you need to kind of transform a little bit to get it into your front end, you can do that and then put it in Redux so that you're not doing that transformation over and over. Another thing on this topic is selectors. So at first when I started working with Redux, I didn't really use selectors or understand selectors. Then I worked on a big project where everything went through a selector, and it's essentially boiled down to selector is just a function that takes your app state and returns the pieces you need. There can be as much or as little complexity in there as you want. That could just simply be, you know, an arrow function that takes in a state parameter and returns an object of the things you need out of your state. It could be using a library like reselect where you're memoizing those so that you're not doing these, you know, kind of data crunching to pull things into a component. Yeah, and so that just makes it easy instead of, you know, remembering, oh, every time I need to get the users in our app, I have to look here in the state, then I have to, you know, do this, and like it's a keyed object, and I want an array, so I need to convert that. You can just have a selector that does it for you. Another big plus, testable logic and centralized API calls. Just kind of talked about centralized API calls. Testable logic, the two kind of main kind of frameworks for like async workflows in Redux are Thunks and Sagas. I've worked a little bit with Thunks, a lot with Sagas, so that's mainly what I'll kind of talk about. So Sagas are just a way that outside of your components and outside of your reducers, you write handlers for when an action happens, some other workflow that runs in the background. So API calls are the most likely thing for that, but there are others. I personally really like the pattern of sagas just because they kind of follow the Redux mentality of like a pure function that something goes into, something reliable comes out of, and so they're easy to test because you can put data in and you know what should come out. And then this one's specific to if you're using TypeScript, but if you're using Redux, I really would suggest taking a look at using it with TypeScript. Obviously not feasible if you're working on a big project that's already written and whatnot, but if you're kind of starting something from scratch, Redux and TypeScript go together really, really well because it keeps you from doing things like misspelling an action or putting things in the wrong place or not passing things through it. It just really helps, especially on a bigger team and a bigger project where everybody on the team might not be familiar with every part of the code base. It makes it easier to kind of jump in and see what's going on, make sure you're using things the right way, and catching errors before they hit your users. And then finally, one of the big pluses of Redux as well is the Redux dev tools. I've got a example repo that we'll look at in a little bit. I'll kind of show an example of that. But if you've ever had, an API call in a React component and you're working through it in the debugger and you're like following how things go and whatnot, the Redux dev tools do a lot of really neat things where you can kind of look at the timeline of the changes in the state, of the changes of the state in your app as things go in kind of order, and then you can actually step back through that as well to kind of rewind almost. All right, so here's what everybody laughed about a minute ago. So we couldn't talk about Redux without talking about some foot guns, which I don't remember who I was talking to, but a while back somebody had never heard the term foot gun. So if anybody's confused, that's you shooting yourself in the foot and things to do it with. So one of the main ones that you have to be mindful of, and this is where lots of the like, oh my God, you have to write so much code if you're using Redux, is mutating data. So with React and with Redux, it's important that when new data comes through your Redux store, that it's new data. It's a new copy of whatever was modified as opposed to being mutated. And so easy example of that is here we have a function that we pass in an object and we pass in a name and we want to update the name in this object. So, okay, we set name and then we return it. So this is mutating that original object, not returning a new one. Could go way deep into what's going on, but the way that Redux kind of diffs things and makes it clear to components whether there should be a change passed through to the component is based on doing what's called a shallow object check. So that's just saying, are these things not equal? And you can get into some weird states where technically you could be looking at two objects here, so one with the name originally, one that was updated, but they're actually the same object since we modified it instead of copying it, and that can cause some funny things of components updating and so on and so forth. So one of the big kind of concepts that gets used a lot in Redux is pure functions. So a reducer is a pure function that takes in an action and the current state and it returns new state. If you pass in the same parameters, you will always get the same result. And so that's what a pure function is. So here, for example, this is and this isn't like a horrible mutation, by the way, but essentially the difference here being that the top function is mutating that original object. The bottom one is returning a new object with a different value. And so this is a pretty simple example, but when you get into a user that's an object with 20 properties or an array of things that you're modifying, some of these like computing the mutated or the computing like a new immutable response, it gets really crazy. You get nested objects and nested spread operators, and you open up a file and you're like, oh, that's horrifying. Another one, and my app that I work on at work that I inherited is very guilty of this, is, sorry, too many fucking files. You get something like this. Like, this is really simple. There's one API call in here. This is a search box at the top of our app. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different files that everything lives in. I tend to go the mentality of like, start with everything together and break things out as it gets unwieldy. Where, some of these are like 20-line files that are all separate. So this is also a personal preference thing. Like, you may really like breaking things out into different files, and I don't like that, but I'm not going to say it's wrong. This is just very common with Redux and the kind of like boilerplate mentality of Redux, where it's like, oh, well, I need this new piece of Redux, so I need a file for actions, reducers, sagas, selectors, et cetera, et cetera. And then another one that's tough that I've seen people kind of struggle with before is overcomplicating, or what is local component state again? Worked with a guy on an app one time that everything was in Redux. There were no set states in the entire Redux project. And I was just like, okay, when I said that everything needs to live in Redux, you took that really literally. And it just gets not, it's not nice to work with when, little things that don't matter, like, is this dropdown open or closed? That doesn't really matter to Redux because it doesn't matter to the entire rest of the application. It matters to this single component. And performance is one of those things where people love to argue about. But at a certain point, you can get to a point where you've got way too much stuff in Redux, and if you've got things like updating and so on and so forth, things can get slow. That's pretty far into like lots and lots of data that every application probably doesn't get to that point. But, it's just I always kind of try to look at it as like, okay, does this little piece of state, does this matter to the entire rest of the application? And if it doesn't, then it doesn't necessarily need to be in Redux. And as with everything, there's exceptions. All right, so I typed best practices, and then I was like, no, I don't want to do that, no. So we're going to go with things to keep in mind. 1, don't abstract the hell out of your code. Write stuff that works, write stuff that solves the problem at hand. Don't try to think of the next 10 problems that you're going to work on over the next year immediately. Again, it depends, but for the most part, write the code you need right now. If you need to reuse it again, maybe you duplicate it, maybe you modify it so it's more flexible. But don't start off trying to be like, oh, this is going to be, this super flexible function that creates API calls and sends off Redux actions and whatnot. Like, just write code that works. And then kind of on the same page of the like too many files is code that works together lives together. So it should be easy if a new developer is working on a project and they know what component they're looking at. They're trying to find the state for it. It's somewhere else in the application. They have no idea. Another one of the kind of patterns that I personally don't like is the like containers versus components. And it's not that you shouldn't have like presentational components that are just the presentation, but sometimes you get these weird like your page components, right? Where there's some logic to it, there's some display to it, but it's very like, you're not going to use that again. You're not going to have 2 account pages in your app. You're going to have 1 account page that has some layout things it needs to do and also has some logic things that it needs to do. And so I like to keep all that stuff together because it makes sense. You're looking at this page and you're like, all right, what happens when this button fires? Oh, go look somewhere else. And then you're looking at how the button fires and you're like, oh, well, what does the button look like? Oh, well, you need to go look over here. Just makes things harder than it should be, which flows right into my next slide. This feels more difficult than it should be. It probably is. Just time and again, Redux projects that I've jumped into. things are just like, don't try so hard, don't overthink things. Just write what you need. And then, not that using the right tool isn't important, but I think more important is using the right combination of tools. So at work right now, our main application state is all in Redux, but we also use context. We also use hooks. You know, that being said, you know, you shouldn't use everything that's out there, because then, you know, you get a project where most everything is done in context, let's say, and then there's, oh, well, this guy worked on this page, and so it uses Redux. Like, that doesn't really work for a team. But, you know, there's times when all you need to do is make a simple little API call. Sure, I could go write all the Redux code for that, but I just need to get a response from an API and do something with it. So a couple different resources, and we'll tweet out a link to slides, and these are clickable. This is a really great one, and this has not been around. Like, I didn't learn Redux when there was Redux Starter Kit. So this is kind of the official, like, so you're getting started with Redux and you're asking questions. Start by using this, because it'll make your life easier. So some of these, I've written some of these goofy, like, you know, reducer creators and action creators and whatnot, like, oh, you know, this is like, I'm writing way too many functions. What if I could pass an object into a function and get an object of functions? And it has been a good decision occasionally, but it's also one of those things where you leave and then the next person that works on it is like, what? I don't even understand what's happening here. So yeah, there's a lot of nice little tools in Redux Starter Kit. It also helps cut down on the Redux boilerplate a lot, which that's one of those, like, things that people kind of bristle about Redux is, like, you have to write so much code to get something working that it's kind of difficult. Another one that I talked about is Redux Saga. This is what I tend to use for those kind of API calls, async middleware, things like that. There's a great section of the Redux docs about using Redux with TypeScript as well. It is a little daunting to start with, because you're like, well, you know, I need to type my actions, and then, you know, how do I, like, well, I don't know what this is always going to look like, so it needs to be a little variable. And there's plenty of ways that you can kind of work through, you know, kind of getting up and running with Redux and TypeScript. And like I said, if you haven't played around with Redux and TypeScript, I'd really recommend it, because it just makes things a lot easier. Obviously, once you get over the overhead of learning TypeScript. Asterisk. All right, so this is just a code sandbox that I'm going to pop open real quick. Let's see. So this is just an example of a Redux app. Surprising no one, it's a to-do list. And the main thing I want to show is just kind of like, for anybody that's not familiar, like, what are the different... Hang on, I need to change this so that it's not this big. No, I just need to change the scaling on the screen and then bump up the font size. There we go. Can everybody mostly read that? Good enough? Okay, cool. This takes a sec to load sometimes. So yeah, so this is just a pretty simple, like, to-do list app kind of thing. We can add a to-do. We click on them and they're completed. We unclick and they're not. And the Redux tools aren't working. Let me try a new tab and see if that works. Nope, I know I opened this earlier. And it had, let me just look at the store really quick. Oh, no, this one doesn't have the Redux Dev Tools. Well, that's a shame. Okay. I'm just going to skip right over that, because not overly worth it without the dev tools was the main thing I wanted to show off. So sorry about that. All right, slides back up there. Yeah. I got that's actually my last slide. So, cool. Yeah. So I know I kind of ran through things. You know, I didn't want to get way into the weeds. As we saw, like most people have a little bit of familiarity with Redux. The big thing that I think has changed recently is, I kind of said this at the beginning, but it used to really be like a requirement. Like you were building a React app, you were using Redux for state management. That just like when I learned React, that's how it felt. It was like, you know, you look at a job description, you don't see React without Redux. And it's definitely coming from, so like I switched into more like application development with React from a marketing background, marketing like website background. And so, you know, lots of the kind of like concepts of Redux, like pure functions, I'd never heard of such a thing before. There were a lot of new like kind of just patterns that I wasn't familiar with and things that I wasn't used to. That the learning curve on that was pretty steep. So I don't think Redux is dead. I think, and you'll see lots of maintainers kind of talk about this of, you know, you get to a point where everybody's kind of taken parts of your library and integrated them into their own, and so maybe yours isn't as necessary anymore, but that isn't a bad thing. That kind of means that you won because you had ideas that everybody else borrowed, copied, or stole. And so that's you know, one of the new hooks in React. I know we've had so many hooks talks in the last year, but like the use reducer hook that's built into React right now is a very basic implementation of Redux. It doesn't have the moving state around or anything like that, but it lets you get kind of a similar experience just within a component. And so I've used that a number of times for, you know, just kind of component state where you have these goofy like nested ifs and whatnot, where you don't want to run into those like weird edge cases where two things are true that you never thought could be true at the same time. And so using a reducer for that is nice. It, you know, it kind of prevents those like random weird states that we've all seen an application get into at once that you're like, so I'm curious, but how did you do this? So, but yeah, I think React has gotten a lot more approachable over the last couple of years with, you know, kind of easier things to use like context and hooks for managing state. So, does anybody have any questions? Yeah. So this question was, how do you determine what should be pushed up into Redux and what should live locally? First, it depends. I won't stop there though. Kind of how I make that delineation myself is kind of like I said earlier, how does this affect the rest of the application? And if it doesn't, then you need to decide, like, is there something I need to put this in Redux for? And you may still find a reason. It's hard, and there's not a very good, like, there's no rule book of, oh, well, if this does these three things, then it should be in Redux. If it does this, it definitely shouldn't. Like, you know, it's kind of one of those, like, just use your best judgment kind of things. If everything's going in Redux, maybe try to decide which things don't need to. It's kind of one of those things I've just kind of gone through on my own and kind of figured out as we go. But yeah, I tend to look at it from a, you know, do I need any of the things that Redux or Sagas are doing in the background for me? Because sometimes, like, it might not be state that's relevant to the rest of the application, but it might have a really complex flow of, you know, I'm editing a bunch of things in a page, and then when I hit save, I need to fire off a whole bunch of different actions that happen. So, you know, I'm updating something, but I also need to upload photos, and then I need to attach those photos back to this. And so, and Sagas aren't the only way to do it, but it's a nice way to kind of have a complex flow of different things that all kind of tie back together like that. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Similar vein, but more on the project level of how do you know when you need to add something like Redux to your project? Me personally, any new things that I'm starting, I'm doing GraphQL and I'm using Apollo. And so that's what I'm using. But as far as like starting off a new project of like when to switch to Redux, I would be hard pressed to say that I would like absolutely 100% based on certain things start with Redux. Depends on the kind of project that you're developing, but if it's something where, you know, think of it as a startup, right? Where you're coming up with a very simple product to start with. And then as you grow, it gets more complex. Like you hit those like complexity and size breakpoints, and then you need to decide, are we using the right things? And that's probably where I would start having that conversation of like, I need to add this. If I'm just making something personally at this point, Redux wouldn't be one of the first things I install anymore. I would start with local component state. I would start with context and, you know, maybe some custom hooks around a custom context. But yeah, so another hard, there's no easy answer, but yeah, well, and you can use context and whatnot to avoid the like props passing all around and whatnot. But yeah, I definitely think it's one of those tools that now like use it to solve a problem and not just like something that you use by default. Yeah. Yeah. So for handling like the immutability in the store, there's definitely a bunch of libraries that you can use to do that. Immutable.js is one. One of the newer ones that I've played with and really liked is Immer. That's actually what's included in the React Starter Kit. Yeah, so there are things to handle that. It also becomes, and it's this classic like learn something new, maintain something else decision that's always difficult. Yeah, there's always the like, now I have to learn another thing. So I have to learn the syntax of immutable.js to use that to do the immutability in the store. Yes.
Do you know if there's any plans for future features, or is it just done?
That's another good question. That kind of contributes to the like dead conversation, right? Is where is Redux going? So they did early, I think it was like midsummer, finally come out with actual hooks for Redux. So instead of higher order components, you can now, there's a like, it's not called use Redux. I think it's like use selector is a hook from Redux. And so that hooks into your store and uses a selector to pull data out. There's also like use dispatch. That's kind of replaces the other part of your connect, which is the map dispatch to props. So that's one of the recent bigger things. I don't actually know as far as like future development kind of things. It's one of those things where like using it is complex, but what it actually does is fairly simple. So I think the hooks were a big thing. You know, I'm not sure like what's next. So, anybody else questions? Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Cool. Let's take a quick 5-minute break, and we will meet back here at 6:58. Feel free to grab some pizza, some salad. It looks like there's still some left here. Drinks, help yourself. Anyway, all right. Let's get things going again here. Andrew's all set up and ready to go. Let's see. Still a lot of pizza here, so if you didn't get some and you're still hungry, please do help yourself. If we have some left over at the end of the event, feel free to take some home. Otherwise, it just ends up usually going home with one of us or in the dumpster or yeah, and no one wants to do that. We feel bad about throwing food away, certainly. So yeah, help yourself. And one other note I wanted to make, if you're interested in speaking next month or in 2020, which is weird to say, but we're getting close. So if you're interested in speaking at all in the coming months, please come talk to any one of us here. David's down here running the stream, and Kevin just gave the talk, so feel free to speak with either of them or myself. Andrew was extremely kind. He gave a talk, just 2 or 3 months ago, yeah. And we were in need of filling one more speaker slot this month, and he stepped up for us, and we're really happy to have him give another talk on responsive, or this time on responsive data visualization. So he's really talented at what he does, and I'm excited for you guys to hear it. So please welcome him with a round of applause, and yeah, thanks.
So I figured I would get all of the buzzwords in this talk, D3, SVG, React, responsive, GeoJSON. I'm going to get everything. So I'm Andrew Schreiber. I work at Owl Labs, but I'm going to go over into a little more detail on who I am. I'm holding this weird because I managed to slice my thumb open yesterday. It was really fun. So who am I? Then we're going to talk about the problem description. I've picked a problem that I'm hoping to tick off every single person in this room. You'll know why. Then we're going to talk about solving it for desktop only and then for mobile solutions. So who am I? I'm a full stack engineer at Owl Labs. We just recently hired our second full stack engineer at Owl Labs. Really small company. We did, however, release the Meeting Owl Pro last week. So if any of you guys are looking for a conferencing room solution and aren't happy with other stuff, let me know. We can talk. I recently, as of 3 months ago, relocated from Durham, North Carolina. So this will be my second talk in 3 months at a monthly thing. Previously, I was at MITRE. Who here has actually heard of MITRE? That's the usual response. It's the largest company that you've never heard of. It's about 7,000 engineers. I worked in the healthcare space. So if anyone wants to rant about healthcare, let me know. My hobbies mostly involve robots and 3D printing. I actually started off at MITRE in robotics and then somehow transitioned into full stack web engineering and healthcare, so still trying to figure that one out. So let's talk about the problem description. Let's talk about politics, because that's everyone's favorite topic, right? So it's election night, and you want to see the results. And I just picked a random state that I just found a graphic for handily here. But you want to display the results. So who here is glued to their computer on election nights? Okay, maybe for you. Usually people are at a bar, or they should be. So we're going to start by talking about desktop only because that's a really easy solution, and that's how most people design their graphics. And you're going to figure out why this is a problem shortly. Then we're going to talk about mobile, which is, I don't know, smaller than that. See, the problem when you start talking about mobile is they're getting higher and higher resolution, but that doesn't mean they're getting bigger. So you're dealing with this lovely problem of, I can't see this map on this 3-inch display. So we're going to do a demo, even though last time I really swore I hate demos. It's still true. I still hate demos. But we're going to do it. So here is a very, very simple thing. This is your election results from 2016 by county. For why this is a bad map, ask me later. It's a terrible map. I hate it. We've got our little election results off to the side, and I don't know why it didn't animate there, but it's supposed to. So you'll notice this obnoxious animation. It's obnoxious for a reason. It's so you know it just slid in. And then, you've got all of your results down here. So this is actually a fairly simple application. I remembered to actually open the code. Application, I really should make that bigger. So there's nothing fancy about this. It is a fairly standard TypeScript application. I've never used TypeScript up until this point, but I decided, hey, I'm giving a talk in 3 days. Let's build a TypeScript application. Always fun. So 2 pieces to it. It's an SVG map and some returns, and that's just the slide-in thing. We'll go through that first because it's really, really simple. There's some animation stuff in here we can ignore. It's a div, then an H2, and then a bunch of other divs rendering some other crap. When I say it's really simple, this is not meant to be, whiz bang CSS. That's not the point. We're just displaying some data. Those little charts you see, it's a very simple SVG with viewbox on it to fix the size, and just drawing some rectangles in it. The map is where stuff starts getting interesting. Point of reference, I did something horrible in here that I really, really don't recommend anyone ever do. I am not loading data over the network. I am just shipping the whole thing. Why? Because I didn't want all that extra code to load the data in. So we're just dealing with this for now. Don't ever do this in a production app. This is a meg and a half that you're bundling into your bundle and sending down the wire before anything loads, and it is terrible. So all it's doing is it uses D3 to generate a projection, parse the GeoJSON, and render a path. This is really all of the code to render that map. You could replace that with any GeoJSON if you wanted to. The only thing you would need to change to do a different state is this center thing, which is just pointing to the geographic center of Colorado. If you want to do Maryland, throw Maryland GeoJSON in here, pick the center of it, and it'll just work. Now, what's really fun, as you may have noticed, as I rescale this window, it does this lovely rescaling thing. And that's step one of getting responsive things. If I want to actually say, hey, I support desktop browsers, but I have a fixed size SVG on there, it's kind of a crappy experience. So the way we did that is two pieces. Let's head back over here to the app. And they're actually done on the SVG element itself. The first one is viewbox, and the other one is preserve aspect ratio. And we're going to hop back over to the slides because I go into detail on what those are. So, as I said, it's very standard. You could probably write this out in about an hour. And that includes trying to find the GeoJSON. So viewbox is the first trick here, and I mentioned it in my last talk as a really quick fix for a lot of problems. What it does is it tells the SVG container that there are X amount of units inside of it. This is where in this infinite canvas you are looking. It doesn't matter what the actual physical size of the SVG container on your screen is. It will always contain between this point and this point. It takes min x, min y, width, and height. It may look like, because a lot of times you started at 0, 0, that it's actually, x1 and x2 and y1 and y2 and that. It's not. Where you can start getting really clever is if you want something that is normally located at 0, 0, but you want it centered, rather than adding a translate onto that object, you can actually center your viewport around 0, 0. And you can technically have SVG elements inside SVG elements, each with their own view boxes independent of each other. And this is a really, really, really good way of giving yourself a nasty headache. And I mentioned that last time, and I'm still serious. It is a good way to give yourself a headache. Where it starts getting funny is all these numbers can be negative, too. So if you have a negative width, now I start here, and I go backwards, so my entire thing is flipped. I don't recommend doing this, but you can if you absolutely need to. The other one, and I've lost my image here. I don't know why. The other one is much simpler. It is, I know why I lost my image, because I moved it. It's preserve aspect ratio. It's used to tell the SVG container, hey, here's how when I rescale, I want you to make sure that this thing doesn't stretch weird. Because it would be useless to have scalable vector graphics without the ability to rescale them in a sane way, right? It requires viewbox to be set. If you try and use preserve aspect ratio without viewbox, it will do nothing. And you'll be banging your head on the table like, what is going on? Why is it not working? And that's why. So here's the options for SVG preserve aspect ratio. Excuse me. You can tell it the X and the Y whether or not it's supposed to be in the middle, the minimum, or the maximum. And then you can tell it to slice or to meet. If you tell it to meet, it's effectively going to scale the thing as large as it can while preserving its constraints. So depending on the aspect ratio of the object, it will scale or shrink. If you use slice, it's going to take a slice of that object, and it will maximize the whole thing. Whichever constraint allows it to be larger that's what it's going to use, and it will slice the other ones. Typically, I use xmid, ymid, and meet. And that gives me, relatively sane scaling for most SVG graphics because I point them around the center. If your stuff is centered off of or is, based off of 0, 0 in your top left corner, you might want xmin and ymin. It just depends on what you're doing and how exactly you want it to scale. But that's the trick for mobile or for desktop scaling. So now let's go to mobile. I don't actually have a mobile device, and I wouldn't have any clue how to bring it up here, so we're going to just cheat. You guys all know Chrome can do mobile emulation, I assume. Okay. So I'm not surprising or scaring anyone. Let's go to an iPad, because that seems like a sane thing to start at. And this isn't terrible. There's some weird CSS stuff that you could fix. The fact this is shoved all the way down and whatever, it's fixable. But where it starts getting really, really bad, so let's go to an iPhone. Who would want to look at election returns that way? It's terrible. And yet, a lot of times, if you go to New York Times or that stuff, this is what you're going to get on election night, and it's just awful. I can't see the map with these, and these are tiny, and it's just a terrible user experience. So let's try something else, and I'm going to check out the different code. Okay, so I just spoiled my talk, but so nothing changed here. I don't know why that's not re-rendering right now. Oh, I know exactly why it's doing that. There's a breakpoint right at 1199, and I have a feeling that I'm off by 1 pixel either way, so there's a 1 pixel deadband in there. So you'll see, apparently now I got my animation back where the map actually tilts. But you'll see this all works. Do note that map, when it comes back in, is going to do that annoying, really, really bad animation. And that's important because it's actually pointing out something. So I can do that. The map doesn't re-render. When I go into, we're going to just skip straight to the iPhone, and I jump back to this. This looks like a completely different application, but it's the same code base. Now, where it gets fun is I'm going to go back into here, and I'm going to go back to responsive. And you'll note that map comes in because it didn't render at all on the phone. So this is not just media queries. Reasons why you'd want to do that. That map's 1.3 megabytes of GeoJSON. Do you want to shove that down a mobile connection that might be slow? I don't. It's also computationally intensive to render, so yeah. So we're going to jump into here. It does look crappy. We could get away with just using CSS to hide stuff. And there is a media query in here to change how the returns actually render. But if I just hide the map, I have to shove that 1.3 megs down the wire, and it sucks. So the simple way to do this in React would be to check the width and conditionally render things based on the width. Everyone in here, I assume, can do that. It's, you can register a window size handler, use state to grab the window size, and render based on that. You've got to remember to tear down the window size and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's actually not that difficult. Conveniently, however, there's a library that does it for us, and it's probably better tested than code that you'd write just as a one-off thing. Plus, it's going to remember to tear down that handler, and you probably wouldn't initially, and then you'd be like, ah, crap, I forgot it. So, as I said, I kind of ruined my mobile demo, but we'll hop into the code. And by the way, code for all this is going to be available. It's on GitHub. But you'll notice I use this library called React Socks. And I have no idea why it is called React Socks. Doesn't make any sense, but it's really convenient. So I wrap my application in this breakpoint provider. I could pass in custom-sized breakpoints. I didn't for the purposes of the demo. If you had specific size breakpoints that you cared about, you can. And then, I just set up this breakpoint render these two things for extra large screens and up. That's 1200 pixels and up width. And then for large and down, which is 1200 and down, actually I think it's 1199 and down, which is where that weird edge case happens, render this. And I'm just returning this returns thing twice with slightly different parameters passed into it. If there's something horribly wrong with my TypeScript, please tell me afterwards, because I said this is the first TypeScript app I've done. It ran, it worked. But that's it. That really is the extent of this. And then, I made some minor changes to the CSS to do a media query. And you'll notice this is exactly where that bug crept in. I really need to have this as max width of 1200. Oops. That's what happens when you're preparing the talk the weekend before. And as it scales down, it will pop back, and then you get the really annoying animation again. And that's it. You can use this for other things. If you wanted vastly different behavior, you can. I don't know why it jumped to takeaways already. The big thing is if you've got, it's my next slide anyway, it doesn't really matter, but if you have a thing that is processor intensive that you don't want to run on mobile, you can do it this way. If you don't want to load data, if you've set up your data loading so that it will only load when it needs it, if you don't need it, now I'm not passing all that down. My customer isn't eating that data charge, and it's not running on their phones really slow. You can have vastly different experiences. You can pass in very different things. Basically, it saves you the trouble of having to write conditional rendering logic. With media queries, you can change your styling, and it's, you get your basically, I can do whatever I want on mobile versus tablets versus desktop. And that's it. Code's available here. I assume we can tweet out a link or something at some point. That's it. Really simple. I try and make small, simple talks, plus I only had 2 or 3 days to work on it, so. Questions, thoughts, or I mentioned politics, so presumably people are going to throw things now. Shoot. It's cutting an onion. All the dangerous stuff I do, I cut an onion. No, it was actually a really sharp knife. That was the problem. Okay. So we're going to go back to the map. No, it's data visualization. Who won? Based only on the information in this map, who won? But you both all know blue won. This is a terrible, useless map. So question 1 when you're building data visualization, what am I trying to answer? If you don't know that, don't touch a line of code.
I thought we were going to get a rant on the Electoral College right there, but so grateful we didn't. Please give him a round of applause. That was great. Thanks so much to Andrew and Kevin as well. This time of year, sometimes it can be difficult to rally speakers, during the holidays and stuff, and hence the reason we have the React meetup a week earlier than we normally would. But I believe I'd have to double check the calendar. I think we're offset again next month, maybe not. It just depends on how the holidays fall. But we want to, accommodate all of that. So again, if you're interested in sponsoring or speaking or even just helping out with the meetup, please come talk to one of the 3 of us here. We would love the extra help. It's super beneficial and just makes it so that we don't have to pull our hair out, the days before the event. So with that, I think we're all good. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thanks again for coming, everybody. Grab some pizza on your way out. Thanks.